So let's keep reading this explanation, Biblical Unitarian. I don't want to take up all the time on this review, this previously on segment. But they go on to say that we reject it also, but for different reasons. So they reject Trinitarian, but for different reasons. They go on to say that taking a concept and speaking of it as if it were a person is the figure of speech known as personification. So there you have it. There's their perspective. They go on to say that, definition-wise, personification often makes it easier to relate to a concept or idea because as humans, we are familiar with relating to other humans. Continuing, personification was common among the Jews, and the wisdom of God is personified in Proverbs. So they conclude by saying Christ is considered the wisdom of God in Corinthians. Why? Because of what God accomplishes through him. And I might add, not necessarily because wisdom is Jesus. That's what they're implying by they say that the wisdom of God is what God accomplishes through him. So they play the agency card quite heavily. When we say agency, we're talking about God accomplishing certain actions, prerogatives, and attributes that we see Yeshua possessing, but it's not because he is innately God, according to the BU perspective. It's because of Jesus being the unique supreme agent of God, has been just like the angel of the Old Testament, angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, been allowed to speak in first person as God to humans, giving the impression that to humans that he is God, but in reality that he isn't. So that's their perspective on who the angel of the Lord is / who Jesus is. All right, launching from that, let's jump into my own commentary. So more than 2 weeks ago, we started into this section known as some brief Hebrew insights. And originally my commentary had some notes that I was utilizing that I realized later on, because I wrote this earlier this year, that I realized later on that I didn't have the right reference points for which Hebrew words that I'm going to be pointing to in the commentary at hand. So I discarded that version. Don't worry, you guys never saw it. You didn't even have a chance because it never made it to the light, never saw the light of day. Only those who in the Skype class caught it. But I discarded that and rewrote this, and so it was great to have a little bit of time for the break. Give me some time to rewrite all of this. So I rewrote this section for the brief Hebrew insights to include the words that I originally wanted. So let's read this. This is a section of my own commentary, which is not available anywhere online by design. It's so that you will make it a point to attend the live studies or watch the YouTube videos or listen to the YouTube comment, the podcasts themselves in an effort to support my ministry in that way. I'll plug into these other resources that I have instead of always leaning on my website at tetzetorah.com. So this is not available on my website. This is exclusive to my YouTube channel and my iTunes podcast. Some brief Hebrew insights. Let's talk about some of the language that we read about. Like when I go back over to zoom that out. When I go back over to Proverbs here, we talk about how the Lord possessed me at the beginning. So we've got kanini, which is the word for possessing. It's the verb in the verse, but it's followed immediately by this noun reshit, which is, if you're familiar with Hebrew, this is similar to the word in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew reads Breshit. Bara Elohim et Shemayim ve'et ha'aretz. Bereshit is composed of a conjunction b, which is in or within or at that time, followed by the word rosh, the root word, which from what we get the cognate reshit, the beginning, the head of. The Lord possessed me at the reshit, at the beginning of his way. Well, how far back are we talking about when we say beginning? If we're talking about an agent of God in Arian fashion, like Jehovah's Witnesses say, well, then this is before the beginning of the creation of the universe. So Jesus is the first thing that God created, and then God created Jesus, and Jesus created everything else, according to Jehovah's Witnesses / Arianism. And we have kind of support for that from verses like this, if that's the way they are to read it. Likewise, this word rosh, the root word rosh, from where we get reshit, is pushed again from beginning down up here in verse 22. It's borrowed again in verse 23 down below. Like you can see, from the everlasting I was established. Again, the proverbist says from the beginning. In the Hebrew, it's merosh over. Oops, let's try that again. Right Okay, that's not working. Give me a moment. Scroll up and go like that. From that Hebrew word right there, merosh, right? From the beginning. So it almost seems, again, like the Jehovah's Witnesses have kind of a slam dunk, open and shut case to make for so follow the logic. If wisdom in the book of Proverbs is Jesus, and Jesus is the one that's described as the agent of God in the New Testament scriptures, right? All things were created by him, before him, and through him, etc., etc. Right? John 1:1 as well. All things were created through him. Then if wisdom is Jesus in the Old Testament, and Jesus is the agent of God in the New Testament, then logic follows from their perspective that Jesus was created by God at the beginning. God possessed Jesus at the beginning, etc., etc. So that's why they're kind of going in that direction. But really what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to some of the Hebrew words that are related to wisdom being possessed, right? Kanini reshit at the beginning, as well as being established, nisachti mirosh, by God from the beginning. And also eventually, as we're going to get into it, when we get down to verse 24, there's this peculiar Hebrew word. Let me read the English first. When there were no depths, I was brought forth, right? In the English there, when there were no springs abounding with water. And over in the Hebrew, when we talk about brought forth, didn't mean to click on that. Let's try that again. When we talk about brought forth, it's this word right here, cholalti. It's a tongue twister for me. And so we're going to be looking at this word, but we're also going to be contrasting or comparing that to some of the other verbs that we already looked at, or that we already highlighted about Jesus being established, as well as, wisdom being established, as well as being possessed. So there's really three words that are kind of driving my understanding of this passage. We've got the kanini word in verse 22, which is possessed in the English. We've got the nisachti word, which is the second word. I didn't highlight it for you, which is right there. Nisachti, which is established in verse 23. And then we've got the cholalti in verse 24, which is the brought forth word. So let's begin to look at some of these Hebrew insights in my own commentary. But in order to do that, in order to get the context of where I'm going to be driving, I'm going to back up to a passage that we've looked at in the past, I believe, which is the book of Psalms, where we use this idea of begotten. So first, I need to rip away from the Jehovah's Witnesses their misunderstanding of Jesus being described as the first begotten, or the firstborn of God. That's who's prophesied, begot, and brought forth. I'm going to take that understanding away from them because they're misusing it. And then from there, I'll launch into Jesus, our wisdom being possessed. That sounds really weird. Jesus being being a possession of God, like a tool, as well as being established by God, and then finally being brought forth by God in what we might call birth language. But this is all kind of rooted in this idea of begotten. So follow along with me. So this is my own commentary. We're not going to finish it tonight. We're just taking a bite out of it. I go on to say the Hebrew word for begotten in Psalm 2:7. So we're going to back up to the book of Psalms before we look at the book of Proverbs. We got this word called yelidtika, which is, I've translated it there as Y apostrophe L-I-D apostrophe T-I-Y-K-H-A, yelidtika. Right, so this is the word for begotten. And its root word is yalad, Y-A-L-A-D. And this word, according to my research, means to bear, to beget, or to bring forth. It's just a standard word for giving birth. Humans can do it, animals can do it. It's not a big deal, really. It's the context that drives what it truly means. But when the Jehovah's Witnesses come along and say this is proof that God gave birth to Jesus somehow, that he created him or birthed him as his own son in a strange, mysterious way, then we need to still go back and look at the way this word is used in the context of God bringing his son into the picture, at the same time linking that up with the fact that this son is someone in God's scheme of things that is primarily the inheritor of God's kingdom, the inheritor of God's glory, the inheritor of God's legacy. And so when we say the firstborn or the begotten one, we're going to have to look at this term from God's perspective as not having to be literally God giving birth to a son. And in fact, to the embarrassment of the Jehovah's Witnesses / Arians, according to God's way of created order, like gives birth to like. So if Jesus is truly the only unique Son of God, how is it that Jesus didn't get passed on to him full divinity? According to the Jehovah's Witnesses answer, he didn't get that part. He's divine, but he's not deity. See how they kind of they have this like splitting hairs difference between playing with certain words in the New Testament that talk about Jesus being deity or divine. Okay, so let's read my own commentary because I'm trying to get ahead of myself. So we got to bear, to beget, or to bring forth. In this context, this word refers to what I have learned as the relationship between God and the prophesied Messianic king of Israel, who is personified by David in the Old Testament. He is the personification of this Messianic king, but is ultimately, as I say, who's referred to as God's son in the Old Testament. But ultimately, this goes on to become the Son of God, Messiah himself. I go on to say, the equivalent Greek word for begotten in the Septuagint is, we're going to get to more Greek later on, but I'm just giving you a sneak preview now, because this is the Hebrew insights. So we've got this gegeneka, transliterated as Gegeneyka, but gegeneka in the Greek stems from the root word genao, and genao means to beget, to give birth, or to produce. So we're talking about a generic word for bringing offspring in from a parent. Again, when we're talking about God, we have to start thinking of, how does this work? How exactly did God give birth to Jesus according to the Jehovah's Witnesses model, where Jesus ends up being a lesser God, a God as a small God. He's a godlike being, even though God says, you shall have no other gods before me. So even if Jesus is a lowercase God, he's still another God, which is forbidden by the Bible. Hello, Jehovah's Witnesses. Are you guys listening to my podcast here? You're listening and watching my videos. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Last time I checked, that includes capital GODs and lowercase GODs, right? The theology works both ways, and yet you're trying to tell me that Jesus is a lowercase God, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a lowercase God. Go back and listen to the commentary that I put in my on my website, where we reviewed John 1:1's in the beginning was the Word, where I soundly reject the Jehovah's Witnesses perspective on John 1:1 with a lowercase God. But nevertheless, let's keep going. We've got a few minutes left in this commentary, and I'm only taking a bite out of this part. So we're looking at Hebrew, we're looking at Greek. Moreover, going back to the Hebrew term that I just read about earlier, cholalti, right, transliterated as CHOLALTI, cholalti. This means brought forth in Proverbs 8:25. Now, notice the similar nuances between the above word for giving birth and this new word here in Proverbs for brought forth. So giving birth and brought forth. There's some nuance similarities between the words. They even sound a bit similar. We have cholalti in one place, and we have yelidticha in another place. They've got some of the same Hebrew letters in there. Right? That's what I meant by similar. But they have nuanced similarities, being brought forth or bringing offspring in. But let's look at this one in Psalm 8:25 or Proverbs 8:25, and then we'll call this part quits for tonight. This term, cholalti, which we read about in Proverbs 8:25, it originates in the root word chul, which is transliterated as CHUWL, chul, and it means to twist, to whirl, to dance, to writhe, or bring forth. So there are some other nuances to the root word that don't necessarily have any relationship to bringing offspring in from the parent into the children. Let's keep reading. Proverbs 8:25 refers to what I have recognized as the personification of wisdom, which was, per the consensus of most biblical scholars, present before the creation of the world. So I don't have a problem with part of what biblical Unitarian describes as personification in their own description. Yes, we can have personification in the Bible with wisdom. In fact, wisdom is often called Lady Wisdom in the personification model because the word wisdom, chokhmah, I believe the Hebrew word, let me just jump back and double check to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding or remembering incorrectly. Verse 12, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. Ani chokhmah. Yes. So chokhmah is the word for wisdom. And in the way that Hebrew comes down to us as a language that includes masculine and feminine grammatical words, then chokhmah chokhmah is a feminine word. And that's why we call wisdom a lady wisdom. So we've got a little bit of personification between wisdom in the Old Testament here in the book of Proverbs and Jesus in the New Testament. And we possibly could also have a direct sort of one-to-one reference where wisdom truly is Jesus. Remember, there's two different Trinitarian perspectives. One is more personification. The other is more that wisdom is, in fact, Jesus. And so both views are representative in the Trinitarian model. So I'm fine with that personification language. I go on to say that even Unitarian scholars would have to concede that the one and only immutable and all-wise God has surely been in possession of wisdom from since time immemorial. So here's where the biblical Unitarians and the Jehovah's Witnesses have to stop and remind themselves. God who is immutable, meaning he's unchangeable. He's all-wise, meaning he possesses all of wisdom. He lacks none of it, and he cannot change to the point where he lacked something and then acquired something. We cannot have wisdom, and I'm closing with this, we cannot have wisdom as a concept or an attribute of God that he either A, created or brought forth before the creation of the universe, utilizing as a tool, as an agent of his creation. We can't have wisdom in that regards because then we have two problems with God. We have one, he was not all wise before he created this tool, and two, he himself changed in a way that conflicts with his nature being immutable, meaning unchangeable. So there would be two problems with God if creation was, if wisdom was something he had to create in order to utilize this tool to bring the universe into existence. So that's one problem that the biblical Unitarians as well as the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to have to contend with in their competing views of believing that wisdom is this personification of God in the BU model that God brought forth or created. Remember, there's at least one passage here in Proverbs that uses language about bringing forth, and then that's it. That's kind of supported by the other passage in Psalms that talks about language of begettal and begetting that the Jehovah's Witnesses use in their description of this figure of wisdom / Jesus as the agent of God. So I hope you're not confused. We're going to continue working through this in time where we are, as Trinitarians, rejecting the view of biblical Unitarianism that wisdom is merely a personification of God, a personification of the wisdom of God, a personification in the sense that it's an attribute of God that he either A, didn't have and he had to whip up in order to make the world, or at least if they agree that wisdom is something God had from the very beginning, the proverbist is just using personification of wisdom to describe an attribute of God as if it's a tool that God utilized, kind of agency fashion in that regards. We're rejecting that as biblical Trinitarians. We're also, of course, rejecting and always will reject the Arian / Jehovah's Witnesses version of God that rejects Trinity, that says that Jesus is the chief creature that was created by God at the beginning, the chief agent of God utilized by God to whip up the world, bring it into existence, and that's who Lady Wisdom is, the first tool that God created in his toolkit. But then again, if that's the case, God's not immutable anymore. He's not all wise. So the Jehovah's Witnesses have a big glaring error in their theology there as well. We'll get to all that in time as we continue looking at this, these brief Hebrew insights into this passage, but that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.